lot of different images, a lot of different teachings. And the one that we're going to look at today is from the book of Luke, chapter 6, verses 46 through 49. A time where Jesus tells a story about two builders who have experience and similar circumstances, a flood, but the outcomes are vastly different because of the preparation that they put in ahead of time and how they built their foundations. So let me read that for us this morning. Luke chapter 6, verses 46 through 49. Jesus says, "Why do you call me Lord, Lord, and do not do what I say? As for everyone who comes to me and hears my words and puts them into practice, I will show you what they are like. They are like a man building a house who dug down deep and laid the foundation on rock. When a flood came, the torrent struck the house but could not shake it because it was well built. But the one who hears my words and does not put them into practice is like a man who built a house on the ground without a foundation. The moment the torrent struck the house, it collapsed, and its destruction was complete." I want to also point out, I'm not going to be talking about physical structures today. I'm going to be talking about you. I'm going to be talking about me. I'm going to be talking about our souls, about our life. And I want to point out also that Jesus does not say if the flood comes. He says when the flood comes, and it will. How we handle it depends entirely on the strength of our foundation. So as we unpack this passage, we will emphasize that floods will come. The question is, where is your foundation? How will you handle the flood? The first part is listening and acting. In verse 46, Jesus says, "Why do you call me Lord, Lord, and don't do what I say?" It is so easy to call ourselves Christians. It's so easy to say all the right things, but Jesus calls us to live out our words. He calls us to action. A great example of that from this trip comes from before the trip even began. Weeks before we left, we learned that there was a diversion. The original plan was for us to go to North Carolina and do work. That's about a 9-hour drive. The new plan is diverting us down to Florida because North Carolina was not ready. When I heard that they were moving us down to Florida, I nearly backed out of the trip. I did not want to drive 14 hours and then go down and be in the Florida sun, the super hot, sticky Florida sun. I didn't want any part of that. So I was nearly about to bow out. In fact, I had reached out to Garen and Stephen. And I said, "Hey, would you guys still go if I don't? If I just stay home?" And then we got on this call together, and then I got extremely convicted. Because God said, "Why would you answer this call when it's convenient? But the moment it becomes uncomfortable, you're like, no, I'm good. I'm going to back out." And I was extremely convicted in that because that's exactly what had happened. I didn't have a good reason not to go. I had a comfort reason not to go. I hate being hot. It's 90% of why I'm a Christian. I don't want to go to hell and burn. I mean, come on. That's a joke. That's not why I'm a Christian. But I was uncomfortable. I wanted nothing to do with Florida. And so my first instinct was to pull out. But in this passage, he says, "Why do you hear what I say and not do it? Why do you listen to the words that I teach and not go and do it?" And then he describes later on what that means about your foundation. What it proved to me is I wasn't really committed to this. I wasn't really committed to the call that God was putting on me. I was listening to the words saying you should go, but I wasn't listening to the calling that I should go and serve. It had nothing to do with the location. God was not calling me to North Carolina to go and help with disaster response. He was calling me to go and serve in disaster response, no matter when, no matter where, no matter what. And I think that speaks into this whole idea of listening and not really doing. Jesus describes that as lukewarm Christianity. When we hear his teachings, when we hear his callings, and still decide not to fall into those, not to embrace them, and to go on doing what we want to do. Jesus does not want passive listeners. He wants active doers. Are we just hearing his words, or are we embodying them in our daily lives? I think it's a challenge that we have to take on every single day. Complacency and comfort are the easy path. Discomfort and struggle That's the hard path. But a lot of times, that is what we are being called to do. In verses 47 and 48, Jesus goes on to describe the wise builder. He says, "As for everyone who comes to me and hears my words and puts them into practice, I will show you what they are like. They are like a man building a house who dug down deep and laid the foundation on solid rock. When a flood came, the torrent struck the house but could not shake it because it was well built." Building on the rock is not easy. It requires digging. It requires planning. It requires intentionality. It is not easy. It requires effort, investment. We have to invest in this relationship with God even when it's not convenient. One of my favorite parts about this trip was getting to work with a group of men and women who come from all different walks of life. Some of the people on our trip have full-time jobs and families at home to be worried about. Some of them, actually many of them, were retired. Some of them have the physical strength to work for 6 or 8 hours in a day. Some of them had the ability to help cook the meals for 150 people 3 times a day, and that was all that they were able to do. But everyone showed up, and they came ready. No matter where they were coming from, I saw them having this unwavering commitment to the moment. Whether it was working in a hard, stinky, roach-infested house, or it was just being in the kitchen, the people were there to serve. This team was committed to the mission of the week, and it was not always easy. In fact, many times it was not easy. Many of them drove through the night to get there in time to go and work. We did not. We stopped and slept because we were less committed to the mission, I guess. But I saw this unwavering commitment. Not just from the volunteers that had shown up. There's a woman there, her name is Jamie, and she's kind of the site director for all of the work that's going on. And so when I get there, I just assume that she lives there and just is kind of organizing. No, she showed up for her own mission trip 3 weeks prior just to go and help for a week. She saw what was happening and decided, I'm staying. And so she's now been there for a month of additional time, investing in these people, doing all the administrative work that it takes to organize hundreds of work teams coming in, doing work, leaving, keeping them safe, keeping them fed, keeping them housed. She saw that and she said, I'm going to invest. Well over and beyond what she had already offered, and most people would have been totally fine with her leaving after a week. No one would have judged her for it. But she felt that call, and I think that that's a great example of what it looks like to be built on the solid foundation. She didn't get pushed aside really easily. She didn't get pushed out of her mission really easily. She saw what God was calling her to, and she put her feet down, and she's committed to it. I think that's what we should all be striving to do, to be that willing to invest in what God is calling us to do, to dig deep and make that daily commitment, to have time in God's Word, to be in prayer, and this willingness to live in obedience. Even when we're facing the storms of life, that deep foundation is going to hold us steady. But there's got to be an opposite to that, right? If we have the wise builder, that means we have the foolish builder. And that's what verse 49 is talking about. It says, but to the one who hears my words and does not put them into practice is like a man who built a house on the ground without a foundation. The moment the torrent struck that house, it collapsed. Its destruction was complete. The foolish builder took shortcuts. And maybe he thought he could get away with just that shallow foundation because, it hasn't rained here in a couple years, right? So I'll be fine. I'll just take this shortcut. But he underestimated the power of this coming storm. And when the flood came, his house was completely destroyed. One of the things that we heard a lot is when the waters finally receded, many people that don't live there full time, they flew down or drove down and they looked at their trailer and they said, I don't want to do anything with this. You can have it. Just figure out what to do with it. Because they saw the work it was going to take to rebuild that trailer and said, I don't want to do that. And so God took that and he blessed it, and many of the people whose trailers were completely destroyed have received those other trailers as a gift, which is an amazing thing to be able to do, so that those who were without now have, and those who didn't want it don't need it anymore, and they've gotten out of it. But as I'm hearing that mentality to come in and say, man, this is too difficult, I'm out, I'm done. I'm like, how often are we doing that same thing in the church? How often do people walk in here, and when it gets a little uncomfortable, when it gets a little difficult, they're like, I'm out. I don't want to deal with that. I don't want your Jesus. I don't want your church. I'm just done. You're not saying things that make me feel good anymore. I'm done. How often are we trying to take the shortcuts to Christianity, the shortcuts to heaven, where we're trying to find the easiest path, the one with least resistance, all the way through to the pearly gates? That road doesn't exist, because our road is called to go through the world, to be in the world with people, loving on them right where they are. That means we're going to walk up to people that are completely devastated by the floods of life. And the first instinct is going to be say, I'm done. I'm not working on this. But God is calling us to go in, to rip out the floors, to rip out the electric, and to rebuild that person from the ground up. We cannot take shortcuts when it comes to this path of life, when we're talking about this spiritual journey. The world is going to offer us plenty of distractions and quick fixes. But none of these things are going to sustain us when the floods come. When we're tempted to take those shortcuts, Jesus warns us that life built on sand will ultimately collapse. If you are not dug down to the rock, you will not stand the floods of life. And the last part I'm going to talk about is the fact that that flood is going to come. We cannot escape that reality, whether it's a loss of someone that you love, it's a health complication, it's financial ruin, it's a fire, it's whatever. The floods of life are going to come. There will be disappointment. You will have loss, and you will deal with temptation. It's not a matter of if, it's a matter of when. The people that we served on this mission trip knew that reality all too well. As they watched the waters rise and their houses become destroyed, the reality of life had to have set in. But a lot of them displayed this remarkable strength to stay rooted in their faith to Jesus. And the one main example that I want to talk about is Miss Kathy. We worked at her house, Garen and I, and Stephen and Brian J. worked at her house for the last 2 days. We got this work order. See, what happened is, I didn't tell anybody that I knew how to do construction stuff when I went, because I didn't want to be responsible for anything. I just wanted to show up and do work and do my thing. But I open my loud mouth and I tell people how I know things, and so we get this work order for electrical work because no one else on the site was comfortable with it. And I said, we'll look at it. Garen and I were like, we're not licensed, but we'll look at it, you know. And we walk in, and this poor lady's home had been stalled because of one little wire that would have taken someone 5 minutes to take apart and put in the wall and move, and her whole project had been held up because of that. So we took on that work order, and we finished the electrical, and I said, I don't want to leave. I want to keep working here. She had other things on the list, and so we just kind of posted up at her house, and one of the other big projects was, you know, with the water, they cut the bottom 3 feet of her walls out, and so we reinstalled this bead board, white board that has some dimension to it. It's a really pretty process when it's done. But the process of doing it is not fun. It's very frustrating and difficult, and it looks terrible until it gets finished. And we're never going to get to see it finished unless Miss Kathy sends us pictures. But when we meet Miss Kathy, she's a little overwhelmed, as you can imagine. Most of the people that we talked to were a little bit overwhelmed. They had a lot of things on their plate. Kathy was one of those that received a new trailer after hers was completely destroyed. And so she's dealing with this whole process of mourning her home that she loved dearly, but she's also got this excitement, anticipation of this newer, bigger, nicer home that she's going to be moving into. But the whole time, all she keeps saying is, I just thank my Jesus. I thank my Jesus. And so as everyone's running around this place constantly buzzing, they've got golf carts flying down the road, and everybody's got a mission. It was our last day. I think it was our last day there. I don't know. It's all one long day at this point. But I remember They had taken a lot of stuff off of her front porch and hidden it in the house because, if you don't know, there's another hurricane heading to Florida right now. So everybody's a little scared, and they're preparing for the next storm. So everything had been emptied off her front lawn and put back into her house and stacked up. And it's the first time Miss Kathy has seen her new home without all of her stuff sitting in the front lawn. And I remember watching her just kind of sigh. And you saw this stress drop off of her. And so she goes back in and she rolls this chair out to the front, and she takes it and she sits it with her back to the house, because she said, now all my problems are behind me and I can just look out at the road. And so she sits down in her chair, and for the next hour, she just sits quietly. At some points, I think she drifted asleep, and she just sits there. Garen and I are walking past her. We're cutting boards right in front of her. But there was just this presence of peace from Miss Kathy. In all of the hustle and bustle of this neighborhood, and all of the sadness and the desperation and the depression that was going on around her, you could just sense the peace of Christ in her life. And every time I talked to her, she smiled, she's loving, she's just gentle and excited. And it's like, how? If my house was destroyed today, how would I handle that? And I don't know that I would do as well as Miss Kathy's done. She was incredibly thankful. In fact, she got us Chick-fil-A milkshakes one day for lunch, which just slowed us down because we were sugared out at that point. But she was so loving. In the face of destruction, she is so loving. She cared about her neighbors immensely. She took time to talk to them. She knew everyone's name. And it was an amazing opportunity for us to minister to the person that's ministering to the people in the neighborhood. And so that's why when we had the opportunity to bless her with a financial gift, I knew that this was the person to give it to, because I knew that she would take it and use it in a wise and loving way. But I think her example challenges us to think about our own spiritual foundations. Is your faith as strong and unshakable as hers was? In the face of a storm, would you be able to pull out a chair and take a nap on the front porch? I don't know that I could. But I think that we should be able to, as followers of Christ. We should have a peace about us that lets us take a nap in the face of a storm, that lets us exude peace in the face of just crazy destruction. And so coming out of this week, the only question I can come up with is, where is your foundation? Are you building on the solid rock of Jesus Christ, or are you relying on things that will not last? Are you working so hard on building up your retirement portfolio that you're not investing in your spiritual walk? Are you working so hard to make sure that your house and cars are the nicest ones on the block? Or are you reading deeply into Scripture and learning the things of Christ? I think the message of this experience is a call to examine our lives and make intentional choices to strengthen our foundation. Jesus invites us to dig deep and to put his words into action, to trust that he will hold us steady when the storms come, to trust that he will provide for the things that he is calling us to.